From the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum. The North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
We're very pleased to bring you part 2 of our 2-week series dealing with professional photography. And for any of you, the viewers who were not with us last week, our guest was Tim Christie, who's a professional photographer, and we discussed a lot of the techniques of that profession and that artwork. And this week we're going to look at actually his work. He is very, very gifted, and his work appears in sports magazines throughout the world. As I said, our guest is Tim Christie, who's a member of the faculty at North Idaho College in the Department of Speech, and has this really second wonderful occupation. And Tim, welcome back. We're so pleased to have you here, and
thank you.
We're excited about looking at some of your works. I know our viewers will be interested in admiring that as we do. And we're very pleased to have our regular panelists back, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Vice President for College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and we will invite Janelle Burke to commence today's questioning.
Tim, it's always very interesting to talk to you. One of the questions that I have is, if I had something that I would like you to photograph, people are going to see these wonderful photographs in a few minutes, and if I had something that I would like you to photograph, could you come out to my house and photograph, or another professional photographer come out to my house and photograph that bird or that animal that is one of my favorites?
Yes and no. All right. Yes, in the sense that that's always a possibility. One of the problems with photography is that there are limitations based upon the equipment that you have and what have you. One of the perceptions that many people have is that just because you have a long telephoto lens that you can bring that animal up right and be real close to you and get good photographs. And the truth of the matter is most good photographs are taken at a distance of under 25 yards, even with big lenses. Now, if you're talking about, that's a good size animal, like an elk or a deer. If you're looking at something like a bluebird, you're probably talking, the good photographs are taken 15 feet away. So if a person has a situation, for example, I had a situation a couple years ago where a person had a pygmy owl in their backyard, and he called me up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I had this pygmy owl, and he's been catching mice that are eating on our sunflower seeds for our birds that are coming in this winter, and he has a mouse. And so I got dressed and ran over there with my lens, and sure enough, here was this pygmy owl, and I was able to get within 15, 20 feet of this pygmy owl, and he didn't care that I was there, and I took some wonderful photographs of him. But a person who has a bird that's nesting on the top of one of their ponderosa pine trees, or a red-tailed hawk way up on a tree or whatever, the probability is that you can't get a good photograph. But every once in a while, I get someone who calls me up and says, hey, I've got this flock of wild turkeys, and we feed them during the wintertime, and we feed them in the spring, and we'd love to have you come out and photograph your wild turkeys. Give me a call, and I'd be happy to come out and check it out. I can't guarantee anything, but I'd be happy to check it out.
This is a good time before we go to Steve Shink to give a telephone number for those situations that arise. You may have an award-winning wildlife photograph. Tim Christie can be reached at area code 208-765-2795. For those viewers who didn't get a pencil, I will do this again later in the program. Steve Shink.
And he's already mentioned that he doesn't mind being awakened at 6 a.m. as long as the
The question is, how about 3 a.m. in the morning?
Yeah. It better be good. It better be really good.
The audience is anxious to see your photographs, so I'm going to give you a quick 2-part question. Part 1, are you self-taught, or were you schooled at all in the art of photography? And part 2, when did you change over from pursuing photography as a hobby and suddenly decide that it had a business potential for you?
That's an interesting question. I picked up a camera originally to take pictures of my son, who was then 3 or 4 years of age. I was the college's first public relations director, which you took that job a number of years later, and I had to learn how to run a camera for that job. because we had to take the grin and grip kind of photographs, and so I had to learn that. And I didn't know anything about photography. So the only class that I've ever taken was a basic photography class here at North Idaho College, and it is the absolute minimum class that I would say, and anybody that's interested in photography, you have to learn how a camera works, you have to learn what film does and doesn't do, etc. And I began taking my camera whenever I went hunting and fishing. And it got to the point then that I was just absolutely mystified by what I was able to do with this camera. And it got to the point where I was now going on photographic trips instead of hunting and fishing. And as I began taking more and more photographs, my wife began asking the question, so now what are you going to do with them? And that's a very good question. You spend all this money on equipment, and you spend all this money on film, and you spend all this money on trips. And the hardest thing for me to do was to take the next step, because there's a real, you look at the photographs and you like them. You look at photographs that are in magazines, and those are beautiful photographs, but those people have taken the risk of stepping into the arena. And I always tell people when I talk about giving a public speech, as I teach public speaking or a public presentation, I say the greatest risk is when you step in the arena. And that was the challenge for me. And my wife kept saying, Tim, your photographs are every bit as good as those in the magazine. Try. And I got very lucky. The first magazine I ever submitted photographs to picked a photograph, and they used it on the cover of a magazine. And then 2 months later, they picked another one. And so instantaneously, I had success. I can tell you the hardest thing there's a lot of hard things about being in the business part of it. The hardest part of it is dealing with rejection, because you deal with rejection all the time. Last year, I spent the better part of a week pulling a whole bunch of photographs, almost 600 photographs to put together for a book project. And the deal was all set. Everything was, everything but the ink on the contracts was signed. Everything was done. And an accountant said, we're not going to do this. And here you have this whole process, and you put all this work into it and all of this creative thought, and all of a sudden it evaporated. And to say that that's depressing is an understatement. But that's what you have to deal with, and because you have to believe that when you send photographs, that you've got a real legitimate chance of that they're going to be published.
Thank you.
With the rejections, may I add that you've had also great success and had a lot of your wildlife photography accepted with really prestigious magazines. We've been promising the viewers that we were going to do some of your works now, and I'm going to ask our staff in the control room if they will bring up the first one. Here we go. Tim, if you'll take us through these.
Okay. Elk is an animal that I absolutely just love to be around. Fall for me is being around elk. There is something that's just absolutely mystical about the critter. This happens to be a photograph that was taken up in the Canadian Rockies. This is a big bull elk. He's got a harem of cows. This is a situation that I have been working to get for the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. I have never had this until this fall. We got up to the Canadian Rockies. It started snowing. It snowed all night long. There were 6 inches of fresh snow on the ground, and it broke off blue sky sunshine. And this bull, it was in the late fall or late part of the rut, and here he is laying his head back and he's bugling. And I love the mood of the cows laying there in the meadow. They're pretty unconcerned about him. One of them is in the background. They're feeding, and he's got his neck out there and he's bugling. And when I got there, I was jazzed. I mean, this was pretty exciting stuff.
This is a real trophy when you get one like this. Mm-hmm. If we could see the next one then, that would be really helpful. So they've had to go put the next one up.
And that's fine.
So
that's fine.
But when you take a photograph, then you know what is happening. What you're really capturing.
And that's the sign of in terms of photography, is being able to see it in the viewfinder and to know that the light is right and what to do with the light. Because photography, while many of your cameras now have autofocus, they have auto exposure, they have all these auto things going on, in many situations or some situations, you have to know how that camera is going to operate and what it's going to see. And snow is one of those situations where the camera can be tricked relatively easily, and so you have to know what's going on. That in that situation with the elk, it was a pretty, technically it was not real tough, but it was one of those things that I had to work at to be able to get the exposure right for the bull and the snow was right and what have you.
If we could have the next photograph, here we go.
Okay, this is a bullwinkle, big bull moose happened to be in Denali National Park up in Canada, or in Alaska, I should say. In 1992, I took a leave of absence for 6 months, and I spent about 3 weeks up in Denali, and this was a bull that was out feeding in the willows. It's not exactly this photograph, but a photograph very similar to this is going to be on a book that's coming out in the next month or so on moose. And the colors are, the television doesn't show it quite as well, but the colors are real spectacular. There's lots of reds and golds, and he's not a particularly big bull, but he's a very nice bull and he's very attentive. Bull moose stand. Alaskan bull moose stand 7 foot tall at the shoulder, and they have a tendency to be very cantankerous. I have been chased by bull moose through the willows in Alaska and had my spirit scared significantly.
So whatever you're doing, it really makes a difference, whether it's a small animal or a large animal. Here's the next one. Here's another very large animal.
Okay, grizzlies, again, are one of those things. Moose are potentially dangerous. Elk are potentially dangerous. I've been chased by elk. Grizzlies are downright deadly. They kill people, and you have to know what you're doing. This particular bear, I was literally parked in my pickup. I was out of my pickup at the time, but this bear was right alongside a highway, and he happened to be walking down a log there, and he's walking right towards me.
But your vehicle's close enough if you
my
get in trouble.
vehicle, yeah. Photographing free-ranging grizzlies is a stupid thing to do, and I can't emphasize that enough. There are places like Katmai National Park and Denali National Park and McNeil River where you can get into situations where you can photograph them relatively safely, but by and large, free-ranging grizzlies are not something you just go out and
If I can break in for just a second, wasn't a friend of yours killed recently?
Yes, there was he happened to be killed up in Russia with a bear, and then there was a couple of people that I've been acquainted with who have gotten killed with bears too.
But look at the rest of the photographs then now. Here's the next one.
Kind of provide a segue between the last photograph and this photograph. Grizzly bears have been an endangered species in the lower 48 for a number of years, and now they're at the point where there's very good hope that, or a good chance that they'll be taken off the endangered species list for good reason. Wolves, of course, were transplanted into Yellowstone National Park, and that's one of the things that I try to do is I not only photograph things like elk and moose, which are big game and are hunted, but I also try to photograph animals that are endangered or threatened. And here's a wonderful example. The wolf is, in my mind, is one of the great success stories as far as reintroducing it into Yellowstone. I know that opinion is not shared by everybody in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, but that's my opinion. But photographing, here's an example of where autofocus enabled me to photograph something that I could have probably never photographed before, because autofocus now is able to keep up with an animal running directly at you at a speed, and this wolf is moving. He is, as you can tell, he's in the air, his feet are all stretched out, you've got the snow coming up behind him, and that's what the new technology enables you to be able to do.
We'll take the next photograph here. Oh, what a great one.
Now, here's another example of animals and kind of an educational thing. The Canadian lynx is on the verge of being endangered, and it's right on the cusp right now, and there's a good chance that it's going to be endangered. This is one of those animals that was photographed in a controlled situation. This is a captive lynx. However, it's one of those things where you can photograph it, you can help to educate people with it, with those kinds of photographs. Editors can use it to talk about the dilemmas of the Canadian lynx and those problems. as much time as I've spent in the woods in Canada, in the United States, whatever, I have seen a pair of Canadian lynx. I know people that have spent their entire lifetime that have never seen a Canadian lynx. Of course, the cute photographs, the cute cuddly ones are ones that are always relatively easy to market. Red fox, which are not necessarily indigenous to this particular area. This particular photograph was taken over in Montana. And good photographs combine a lot of things, but one of the things that every good photograph has is the emotional reaction that people give it. And this is one of those photographs where people go, "Oh, how cute," And it's the combination of the wonderful look on the fox's face, but you've also got the purple lupin, and he's peering around the lupin as if to, playing tag with you or hide and seek or what have you.
That was a great photograph.
We talked about bluebirds in photographing bluebirds, I think, earlier, and this is a photograph that I took this last spring. And I've gotten into taking more and more bird photographs in recent years. This, of course, is the Idaho state bird. This is the mountain bluebird. And I set up my blind next to a nesting site, and the male will come in and feed the young with the female, and it's a matter of setting up the blind and having the patience and the perseverance to be able to get the photograph. The thing about this particular photograph is that the background is all blurred out, and so it enhances what you see in that particular photograph. It's because you've got the bird and you've got the perch and you have nothing else to distract it, and of course that really helps a lot too. This is a saw-whet owl. This is an owl that's very common in North Idaho, perched on some fall foliage. And one of the things that makes great photographs is color. You want to have color. You want to make it snap. You want everything to, jump out at you. And of course, the kind of film that a person uses, enhances, actually makes the colors look better than they really are. And there's a little bit of that going on here, but you have the nice intensity of the owl looking at you, and the eyes are very captivating, and what have you.
That was a great photograph. I believe we have a couple more. Here we go.
Another thing that I do a lot of photographing of is fishing and hunting and camping and things like that. I am an avid hunter, and I spend a lot of time in the woods. I do quite a bit of fishing, but I do quite a bit of writing. In fact, this photograph here accompanied an article that I wrote last year called "Continuing the Legacy," about the need for us to be able to continue the relationship that we have between human beings and the land, and that we are getting so far separated from that, and that people now buy all of their meat on plastic trays and what have you. And this is a photograph of a father and son sharing a private moment along a ridge line. Actually, the father is telling the son a joke, and they're getting a good laugh. But I do quite a bit of human interest kind of photography as well.
And then I think we have one more photograph.
Actually, this photograph was taken last week, and this is a photograph of myself. It's a self-portrait and my son. And I have tried to raise my son close to the land, in hunting and fishing and what have you. And we were in elk camp. We were hunting elk, and I have been working to try and figure out how to take photographs of people around a campfire for probably about the last 5 or 6 years. And every time something would go wrong. And in about the last 2 months, I have done a whole bunch of reading and I've done a whole bunch of experimenting. So I've finally got it down. And what I was able to do is I have, from a technical standpoint, I have a flash that's laying on the ground at the base of my feet that's got a gel over the top of it, an orange gel. And then you take the photograph, you meter off of the two people in this particular case, and you get the right exposure, and then you use the flash, and it gives you a little bit of fill flash in there, and so you get this nice, well-illuminated scene, and you've got a nice situation of a father and son sitting around a campfire talking with one another.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. That was so essential for the viewers to see what you're doing. With that, I'll turn to Janelle.
Earlier in the program, Steve asked you a question about your formal training, and you indicated that you had taken a class. And I know there are classes that are given, but you also attend workshops, don't you?
I have attended some. I belong to an organization called the Outdoor Writers Association of America, and they have annual conferences and they have some workshops. And I have attended some of those, but most of my background comes from being self-taught. If I were to study photography right now, what I would do is take some basic photography classes and I would study art, because photography is all about composition. It's all about understanding line and form and positioning of things and what have you. And if I look at the people who are really successful in photography, most of them have an art background.
Steve Sheen.
Tim, a number of years ago, you and I had a conversation. You may not recall, but I've never forgotten. We were in the locker room at a health club we belonged to. You just gotten back from a sheep hunt. Mm-hmm. And you were explaining that it was for various reasons. You asked yourself at that time, what's the one thing I want to do in my life before it's over? And it was sheep hunting. Across the counter and around behind some other lockers, somebody's voice, we couldn't even see the guy, said, "Red Corvette." But I tell the story partly because it's one of my favorites, but partly because I wanted to ask you, that was a hunting trip that you really wanted to make. What about photography? Is there something that you absolutely want to photograph you haven't had the chance to photograph yet?
Yeah, I want to photograph polar bears. And in fact, I'm going to try and make the time in the next couple of years, somehow figure out a way of making the time. There's the polar bears concentrated in a place called Churchill, which is on the Hudson Bay, and it's right about this time of year. And what happens is that they wait for the ice floe to freeze so that they can go out on the ice and start hunting seals. And so all of these polar bears come in and congregate. And I have photographed black bears and I've photographed grizzly bears, and I have always wanted to photograph polar bears. And it's a tough shoot because you've got white animals on white snow. Mm-hmm. That's tough. You've got very cold weather. I know a friend of mine that was up there for 2 weeks one time, and the highest temperature that he had to work in was 25 below zero. So it was, they're real tough conditions. But polar bears fascinate me. They are just such incredible critters.
I've got to ask a couple of quick questions about that. It's got to be a bit dangerous. Some naturalists, I think, will tell you that while grizzly bears are certainly dangerous, they're unpredictable, and that makes them dangerous. The most deliberately dangerous bear might just be the polar bear.
It is the only animal that will stalk a human being every time they get a chance. A grizzly bear will oftentimes run away. A polar bear is purely carnivorous. Grizzly bears and black bears are omnivorous. They'll eat primarily vegetation and then eat meat when they have the opportunity. Grizzlies will kill. Black bears will on rare occasions. Polar bears, all they eat is meat. And so they will hunt a man down and kill him. But what they do is that they've got this commercialized. They have what are known as tundra buggies, and they are these large bus-like vehicles that have these huge tires, and they go out on the tundra and you shoot out of the tundra buggy, and you literally live, eat, sleep, photograph everything in this tundra buggy as it drives around on the ice pack.
One more quick question.
Sure.
Years ago we talked about this on your last show, but since we're talking about bears anyway, and many people will not have seen that previous show or maybe don't remember it, you had a very close encounter of your own,
right?
Photographing bears.
I was photographing a white-tailed deer.
Oh.
And I was in Glacier National Park. I had a white-tailed deer walk, to make a long story very short, walk across the road in front of me. White-tailed deer are particularly hard. I had never had any really good photographs of a big buck. This was a nice buck. He walked across the road. I jumped out of my truck, grabbed a camera, went in, spent 2 hours photographing. He didn't care that I was there. He had great photographs. All of a sudden he got very nervous. In a matter of a minute or so, he disappeared. He took off. I heard noise behind me, thought it was somebody coming in. Another photographer who had seen my vehicle was coming in to see what I was doing. Turned out to be a sow grizzly bear and her cubs. I saw through the brush this little cub ran through and bawled. It's a terrible sign. When they bawl, mom's mad. I think what happened, don't know for sure. The sow ran to make sure that the cub was okay. In the meantime, I'd turned around and there was a red fir tree there, and I started climbing up the red fir tree. She came and hit the tree just like a pickup truck hitting the tree. I was halfway up this 25, 30-foot tree at this point. It shook just like a truck had hit it, and she started climbing up the tree after me. Grizzlies can climb trees. They use the branches like the rungs on a ladder. She came up the tree after me. I vividly remember looking down. Her teeth are just popping. She's growling. She's junkyard dog is the best analogy. She grabs a hold of my foot. Luckily, my foot was in a position she got a hold of my heel. She thought she had me. She just let herself go. She was going to just let her weight pull me down. When she pulled down, my shoe came off. I went up the tree faster, highly motivated.
I think you get a photograph of those teeth.
No, that's what the editor of the magazine said. And so where's the photograph? And I said, Vic, my butt is much more important than any photograph for you. Anyway, she fell down out of the tree and then broke all the branches off and couldn't come back up the tree after me. I obviously made it out of the tree. What is real spooky about this, eerie about this, the same hour of the same day, I was in Glacier National Park. Another photographer saw a grizzly bear out in the Hayden Valley in Yellowstone National Park, stalked her. She was on a bluff. He walked underneath the bluff, walked up on top of her, apparently surprised her at less than 40 feet. She attacked him, killed him, and when they found his body 3 days later, she had consumed 2/3 of him. Same hour, same day.
That is a very serious note on which to end the program, but there's a challenge to what you do. I do want to tell our viewers again, Tim, your telephone number is 208-765-2795, particularly if they have something in their backyard that's more peaceful that can be photographed. I'm somewhat shaken by that story.
Don't call me and complain, okay, about wildlife photography. Only if you've got something good to let me shoot.
You have been so gracious to give us 2 programs, and we appreciate it very much, and we congratulate you on your publishing the works. And also I want to add that people buy your works, too, and hang in their homes. I've seen some of the just gorgeous developed photographs.
Yeah, a lot of commercial accounts. I have banks and office buildings, and I have great big huge photographs that I'd love to sell.
Thank you, Tim. Your work is so wonderful, and I thank you for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this very same time, when we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho, local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
For the next 2 weeks, our program is going to be discussing professional photography. We're looking at wildlife photography, and we could not be more fortunate than to have the guest that we do, who is certainly in that classification of a professional photographer. Our guest is Tim Christie. He is a colleague at North Idaho College on the faculty in the Department of Speech. In addition to his outstanding work as a member of the faculty, he has for many years been a photographer, and his works have been published in many of the wildlife magazines all over the world, and including the cover page. And so we're very delighted that he could come back. About 3 or 4 years ago, Mr. Christie was on our program, and we received the most responses of any program that we've done, and we're so delighted that he's agreed to come back. Tim, welcome to the program. It's great to have you here for the next 2 weeks.
Thank you for inviting me back.
And as always, I'm pleased to have our two regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Vice President for College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
I know that there are going to be some members of our audience who are going to be professional wildlife photographers, but for the most part, the people who are going to be watching are people who would enjoy doing this as perhaps a hobby or who have an interest in wildlife and would want to take some pictures. What are the most recent trends in wildlife photography?
Well, there's a number of things that have happened in the last 5 years that are probably I would consider probably trends. One of the things has to do with equipment. Equipment has continued to evolve. Now we have autofocus cameras that focus the camera for you, and it allows you to be able to photograph things much more rapidly. And for example, animals that are running, you can track them and those kinds of things. Of course, digital photography is on the forefront right now. The idea of being able to reproduce an image digitally and then be able to manipulate that image, and that's caused an enormous amount of controversy in the last couple of years. There have been books that have been published where the people who bought the book, or in the book itself, it's not indicated, but some of the photographs were digitally manipulated. For example, animals were put into the photograph that weren't there in the original image, and animals were taken out of the photograph or repositioned in the photograph. And then when people found out about that, they suddenly got all excited about it. Advertising, of course, has led the way in this. And for example, there's one ad where there's a polar bear looking out over the water in Antarctica. And of course, polar bears don't exist in Antarctica. And so you're putting things in places where they don't exist, and that kind of thing. There's another controversy, if you will. Photography is always embroiled in controversy because I suppose of the technology and the kind of thing. But there's a controversy about where photographs are taken, and because there are places now, as there have been for years, where they raise animals that are in the wild. For example, wolves and grizzly bears and lynx and snow leopards and Siberian tigers and whatever. And what you do is you pay a fee, and these people take this animal out into a large enclosure, but it is an enclosure, and then the animal is let go, and you photograph it in what appears to be a natural environment. And the biggest controversy is that some people think that that's not the right thing to do. Other people think it doesn't matter, and so you've got this horrific debate going on between photographers, and so it's, those kinds of controversies go on and on.
Steve Shink.
Tim, let me follow up on that for just a minute because I find it interesting, and maybe the audience will too. Are there magazines, publications out there that draw a pretty definite line in the sand? We won't use staged photographs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They are. There are. They are the minority. Mm-hmm. They tend to be the higher paid markets. Typically, sometimes they're not. That isn't always the case, but that's sometimes true. But I think where that is finally settling out is each individual photographer gets to make their own decision as to what is right for them, and then making sure that whenever you send in the photographs that you are very clear with respect to this is a situation in a controlled that is a controlled situation, and that, so you're not misleading an editor where an editor is taking a photograph and thinks it's a wild animal and then says it's a wild animal and then comes to find out that it isn't, and they're embarrassed, and then they get mad at you, the photographer. I have a real bias with respect to this because I think photography is art, and some people consider this a rationalization, and they can consider that if they want. I'm very comfortable with that, but it's like a painter, and I have sold photographs to painters. They take my photograph, they paint exactly what's on that photograph of the animal. Then they go out and take a photograph of a mountain scene, and then they paint the photograph of the mountain scene, they put the two of those together, and they get paid $25,000 or $30,000 for that original painting, and then they make lithograph prints of that and sell 1,000 of those at a price of $175 to $250 or $300 per print, and that's art. But a photographer can't do that because it's cheating. I don't buy that. I have a real problem with that. For example, mountain lions. I spend around 150 to 200 days or parts of days in the mountains in one form or another in the outdoors. I have never seen a wild mountain lion. Never. Do I have photographs of mountain lions? I have hundreds of photographs. I've taken them at game farms. I've either been on workshops where they've had a mountain lion at the workshop, or I've either hired the mountain lion. But they are in very natural situations. I label them as such. Editors, if they want to illustrate an article on the problems with mountain lions as they're now becoming more and more of a problem, they need a photograph of a mountain lion. If they had to have somebody go out and find a mountain lion in the wild to photograph it, that photograph would be incredibly expensive and they couldn't afford to pay for it. I see myself as being a photographer who is an artist who illustrates it, but I do it on a very pragmatic way. It doesn't matter to me how or what animal is photographed as long as the animal is treated fairly and humanely, and that it's taken under reasonably natural situations, and that I don't believe in some situations where people have had them chained down by a collar and whatever, and then you take it, and I don't buy into that. But it's, it is one of those kind of issues that falls on each individual photographer from that standpoint.
Tim, I'm going to follow up just briefly.
Sure.
You touched on the issue of artists who, in a sense, use composite images to produce a finished work of art. Your animal, photograph that you've taken of an animal for part of their image, and then a totally separate photograph for the background.
Right.
As you well know, it's possible to do that photographically now, especially with digital images and the ability to manipulate them. Do you do any of that in your work, or do the people who buy your photos prefer to do that themselves?
Well, I am just now stepping into the area of digital photography, and it's not from the standpoint of trying to manipulate my images. From my particular standpoint, I don't like that. I don't, there's something very foreign about that. I'd rather, the photograph that I see is the photograph that I'd like to capture. And that's where I get my rush, if you will. And that's where I get the energy from creating that art. What I want to do with the digital part of it is be able to, because of the marketing, that's where marketing is going as well. You're getting to the point now where you're having editors that'll call me and say, where's your web page? Or could you send me a scan of 4 or 5 photographs that you have of a bull elk bugling in a snowstorm? And instead of packaging those photographs up, sending them to them, and only to find out that that's not what they're looking for, it'd be much easier to be able to put it in a scanner, be able to put it on an email and send it electronically and do it that way. And so I'm entering it into that standpoint. I don't see myself ever getting to the point. I'll probably dink around with them and play with them, but by and large, that's too much work for me. I have a hard enough time keeping track of my 80,000 images, let alone and do all those things, is to go home and spend all my time playing with all of the images too.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Tim, I want to share with our viewers that on the program next week we're going to actually look at your work, some of your works, and we'll save until then the different kinds of photographs you've brought and captured. But I want to follow up on the techniques of a professional photographer, and I want to compare it with another profession. In the field of the political process, when someone can be trained about the discipline of government and its policies and its theories, one cannot teach that individual charisma, and one cannot teach that individual to be visionary. There's some great statesmen who have been visionary, but that's not taught. The same thing in photography. Is it true that you obviously have many classes that people take that talk about different kinds of cameras and different settings and different views and all, but are there certain things about this artwork that one either has or one does not have?
Well, I can't miss this opportunity. I've never heard photographers compared with politicians.
Now you have. Now you have.
That's truly precious. Okay. Yeah. I in that comparison, I think that's absolutely true. I teach a class in nature and wildlife photography each spring semester here at NIC, and I can have students master f-stops, and I can have students master, all of the technical things, and yet it sometimes amazes me that they can go out and have a perfect situation in front of them, and they can't see the photograph. I think photography. I think you can learn lots and lots of things about photography, but I think that there is an intuitive sense that comes from when I look through the viewfinder, I know when I've got a great photograph. I mean, and people that have photographed with me, I am just, well, not all the time, but lots of times I'm just screaming at the top of my lungs, look at that, whatever. Because it's there, and I know it's there, and I feel it there, and I've been around people that are standing next to me, and they're going, "What? Where? How?" I was in Yellowstone Park a couple of years ago, and it was absolutely fascinating. There was a workshop of people there, and there were probably 25 or 30 people, and they all had great big expensive lenses. I'm sure there was $250,000 worth of equipment sitting there among those 25 or 30 people. And this bull elk had been out in the sunshine, and of course the sun was over our shoulder right on the bull. Everybody was just, photographing just as quickly as they could, and he walked over and walked into some shadows, and then in the background it was all black, but it was all foggy too. And he was now in silhouette against all of this fog, against this black. So you had black bull, lots of white, and then a black background, and I just went ballistic. I mean, I was having a heyday, and I was shooting film as fast as I could put it through the camera. And this guy was going, "What are you photographing?" And I said, "Can't you see that?" And I photographed it, and it's just spectacular material, and I've published it several different times. And here were 25 people standing around with all this wonderful equipment, and they couldn't see the photograph. And it's a matter of being able to, and I think it's intuitive. I think one of the things that has helped me immensely is when I was very young, I grew up in the outdoors. My parents, they gave me lots of wonderful gifts, but one of the gifts that they gave me is an appreciation of the outdoors. I went fishing my earliest memories in my childhood is on a stream bank in Montana fishing. I started hunting and shooting when I was a very young boy, and I have this appreciation, I have a sense of what wild animals look like. And when I see it, I know it, and then I take the picture. And when it's not there, I look for the angle. So I think it's like charisma. I don't think you can just walk up and say, okay, be excited, act excited, etc., because people can't. I teach speech as well. You can't.
Everyone can't be a great orator.
You can't be a great orator. You can't fake passion. You can't fake passion, and that intuition, what you have a passion for. And what I tell people when they say, "What's the key to photography?" I say the key to photography is photographing things that you love. I don't care if you love kids. I don't care if you love horses. I don't care if you love dogs. If you love dogs, you'll take great photographs of dogs if you can master the technique, because you know what a great photograph of a dog looks like. Me, I love dogs, but I mean, I'm not a dog person in that sense.
So it's not, and I'll go back to the panel, but really there's two great blessings you have. You have the intuition to see that scene like you did with the bull elk, but secondly, you were blessed to grow up in an environment where that enhanced that process.
Oh, yeah.
Without either one of those two things, some of the recognition that you so deserved and gotten might be different if you didn't have the two combinations.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. I think it's I think the passion comes from the intuition. I think that there's a marriage there. I think one of the reasons that I love photography and wildlife photography is because I have so much passion about wild things and wild places and those kinds of things. So I'm in my second home when I'm there.
Thank you so much. Janelle Burke.
I know that you teach a class, and this could probably take all semester and many hours, but can you in a short time give us some tips for going into the wilderness and taking some pictures, or going out to the forest and taking some pictures, maybe just that little chipmunk that's sitting on the log? What are some of the things that we need to take along, and what do we need to do? Do you have to have an expensive camera?
Okay. Well, that's a huge question. Probably the thing that I would say to people is that whenever you go in the outdoors, you have to be prepared for the worst possible scenario, and that's staying alive. It never ceases to amaze me the number of people who go out, wearing a pair of blue jeans on a cold, rainy day, and then they're somehow surprised that they're in trouble. Always have the right kind of clothing, always have a little extra food, always tell people where you're going to go. I never leave without telling my wife or leaving a note or whatever to say where I'm going to be. In terms of photographic equipment, any good 35 millimeter camera with lenses that you can change, and they're called SLRs, single lens reflex cameras. Typically for wildlife photography, you need telephoto lenses. I would recommend an 80 to 200 millimeter telephoto lens, and then a 300 millimeter telephoto lens as being a pretty basic kind of thing. What kind of equipment you buy should depend upon what you want to do with the photographs. Equipment can range from anything from $200 for a 80 to 200 millimeter lens, or $300-400 for an 80 to 200 millimeter lens, to $1,500 to $7,000 or $8,000 for a 300 millimeter or a 500 millimeter lens. Understand what you want to photograph. If you're going to photograph chipmunks, do some reading on chipmunks. Learn where there's a lot of chipmunks. Go to places where chipmunks are habituated to people. City parks. I have photographed an incredible number of animals and critters in city parks. I photographed, I got a cover on a very prestigious national magazine that was taken out on the beach here at North Idaho College last spring. It's a photograph of a bunch of geese standing under the sign that says no dogs or alcohol on this beach. And the entire beach is littered with goose droppings, all right? It's an incongruent photograph. We won't allow dogs to defecate on the beach, but we'll allow all the geese in the world to do it. But you go where the animals are, and where the animals are habituated to people. If you're interested in elk, you don't go out and photograph in the Coeur d'Alene National Forest, because you're not going to. There's a lot of elk out there, but they're not going to stand around and look pretty for you. You go someplace where, like a Yellowstone National Park or someplace like that. Most of all, to people, I tell them, if you're interested in photography, and you never have to do anything with the photographs, but just have fun, just enjoy it, and just be safe, and don't do dumb things like walking up to grizzly bears and trying to take pictures with a point-and-shoot camera and things like that.
Steve Sheen.
Tim, wildlife photography is a business that you're passionate about. I think we're gonna talk about the passion in our next show, and get into a little more of your personal perspective. But let's talk a little bit about the business. What's hot right now? What are the animals that you can photograph and know you're going to be able to sell?
Well, without a doubt, white-tailed deer are the most popular animal to photograph, and because there are more photographs published about white-tailed deer than there is anything else, simply because they are the most hunted animal in North America and in the world, in fact. The truth of the matter is that the wildlife photography is used in a lot of venues. They range from everything from the venue of the people who are out or who are hunting animals, and the sports of field and field, stream, and outdoor life, and the myriad number of hunting magazines, to kind of the middle of the road, National Wildlife, Audubon, to the other ends of the spectrum, that they're the people that are going to protect every animal on the face of the earth, whatever. And then there's a whole bunch of middle ground. There's advertising and whatever. White-tailed deer are very popular. I don't know that I really go out and photograph something just because I simply know that I can sell it. I'm more of a generalist. I photograph lots and lots of things. I'll photograph anything that stops long enough for me to take a picture of them, because I know that in some way or another that I have a market for them, because I try and market to a lot of magazines and calendars, and I'm doing more and more work with advertising agencies and what have you now. And I usually photograph things thinking, okay, how can I use this? Where might this be used, etc. And I have not photographed things because I say to myself, how can I ever sell this? And this is one of the byproducts of what's happened to me with respect to photography. I used to just love to go out and take pictures. I don't go take pictures now unless I think I can sell them. And something pretty for pretty's sake, or because it's pretty, while I might take a photograph of it, I'm just not as motivated. It's driven to some extent by the business. But I also am pragmatic about it. I only have X amount of time, and the time that I have to spend, I need to focus on doing the things that I feel that I can do something with. So that's one of the downsides of it, because most of my time is not spent out in the field, as much as I would love to do it. A wonderful example is this last weekend. The most beautiful weekend that we have had in October. We've had wonderful fall. Saturday morning, I woke up and I had 48 rolls of film that I had to edit. From a shoot that I had taken up in Canada about 3 weeks ago. I had to edit them. I edited them. I put them in Pages, and I started entering them into the computer. At noon, I stopped. I ran off to this little honey hole that I have for photographing white-tailed deer, photographed them until 5:30, just at dusk, jumped back in my rig, drove home in about 15, 20 minutes, got back that night, 7 o'clock, ate dinner, went downstairs and finished entering photographs, got up at 6 o'clock Sunday morning and spent all day Sunday entering photographs, labeling photographs, and getting them ready for a submission, then spent most of Sunday night pulling together 2 submissions that I had to send out this morning. So, I got this weekend, I was blessed to have 2.5 or 3 hours of photography, but I spent the whole weekend working on photography.
So this is your warning to those people in the audience who are thinking about a career in wildlife photography, that it isn't all they might think it is.
I measured my time one time. 10% of my time is in the field. 90% of my time is either on a phone or behind a computer or writing letters, corresponding, submitting photographs. It's a 90-10 relationship. And those people who go, I'm going to commune with nature, are in for, if they want to be successful. Now, there are people out there that have stock agents and they hire people and they've got much more money than I do, okay? And they have somebody who is working full-time for them marketing their photographs. I have not chosen to go that route. I have chosen to do that all myself. But it is not all fun and games. And when I photograph, and you can talk to anybody that I've ever photographed with, when I photograph, I work. This is not fun. I mean, it's fun. I have a great time, but it is work. I'm up before daylight. I photograph hard until 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm usually scouting out locations during the rest of the day to try and find out where the animals are or whatever, and then for the last couple hours in the evening, I'm photographing again, get back, you eat, go to bed, and it starts all over again. And sometimes I drive 450 or 500 miles to get to the spot that I'm photographing. So, and then Sunday afternoon, you drive that whole thing again.
We're pretty short on time, but if Tony will allow me one more question. Let's talk a little about risk, and most people think about risk in terms of business. I get the sense that most of your business is speculative. You take a picture and you have no idea whether you're going to sell it or not. Is that generally the case in the wildlife photography business?
There is very little assignment work. Very little assignment work. I have a wonderful relationship with several editors who will call me up and go, Tim, we're going to do an article on this. Do you have any photographs? And I go, no, but. And they'll go, we've got a week. And I can go out and do that. Field and Stream Magazine did that for me last year. They called me up and they said, we need some ATV photographs. And we haven't been able to find the stuff that we want.
All-terrain vehicles.
All-terrain vehicles. and they said, can you do it? And it was the worst week of weather that I had the entire last winter. And I called a friend of mine, and he goes, he works for himself, and he said, give me 20 minutes notice and I'll meet you at the spot. And literally, I shot the photographs on my lunch hour one day because the sun started to break. I called him up. I met him up in Rathdrum. I was standing out there in a suit and a tie out there trying to photograph him in this. He's coming off this hill in an all-terrain vehicle. I called the editor and said, I got the photographs. I FedExed her the film. I had never even looked at the film. I FedExed her the film, and she used the photograph. So
on that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. Tim Christie, but the good news is you'll be back next week to continue this conversation and to show your work. That's what we're very excited for our viewers to see that. On behalf of Janelle Burke and Steve Schenck and our staff, we thank you so much for this week, and we really look forward to your being back. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Christie will be back with us next week to show you some of his outstanding work of wildlife photography, and I know you'll find that very, very interesting and exciting to you, and we'd like for you to be with us at that time when we shall share that at the same time on this program. And I would like to invite you to write to us from time to time and or call us about your ideas and suggestions for this program. We listen to those very carefully. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.